This is a book called Reaching for the Moon by Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz was actually the second person to walk on the moon after Neil Armstrong. And I'm not reading the whole book to you. I'm starting at this point in the book, just because this is what I want you to sort of base your own Reaching for the Moon story off of. The first time I applied to the astronaut program, I wasn't accepted, but I didn't give up. When I applied a second time, I got in. I tried to appear as if I'd always known I'd make it, but inside I was bursting with excitement. I was already a pilot and a scientist. Now I was an astronaut as well. Along with the other men in the space program, I studied computers and instruments, what went right and what went wrong on each previous space flight, and how to survive in the wilderness if my spacecraft crashed returning to Earth. We also had to learn to move in the weightlessness of space. The others trained with the system of ropes and pulleys, but I thought training underwater would work much better. I spent hours in the pool tethered to an airline. The simplest movements, turning a handle, tightening a screw, had to be practiced over and over again. My first space flight was on board Gemini 12. My mission, along with my fellow astronaut Jim Lovell, was to orbit the Earth and to practice rendezvous techniques with another vehicle in space. Once the spacecraft was in orbit, I put on my spacesuit, opened the hatch, and drifted out into space. Only a thin cord connected me to Gemini as we circled the Earth at 17,500 miles per hour, 5 miles every second. It took us less than 2 hours to go all the way around the world. But the speed didn't seem real to me. I felt as if I were gently floating while the Earth spun beneath me. I could see the great curve of my home planet, the brown mass of Africa, night falling over the Indian Ocean, a shower of green meteors tumbling into the Australian desert. After Gemini 12, there was a new mission, Apollo. The goal of Apollo was to put humans on the moon. Many people thought it couldn't be done. They thought that the powerful rockets needed to go that far could never be built. They thought that computers could never do all the calculations. They thought that even if we did reach the moon, we would never be able to take off again to come home. But, one by one, all the challenges were met. Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and I were next in line for a space flight, so we were chosen as a team for Apollo 11, the flight that would land on the moon. 3 years after my Gemini mission, I stood beside Apollo 11's Saturn V rocket. It was sunrise on July 16, 1969. Neil and Mike were already in their places on board. For a few moments, I was alone. All my life, I had struggled to learn, to compete, to succeed, so that I could be what I was in that one moment, an astronaut on a mission to the moon. I felt nothing but calm confidence. I was sure we would make it there and back. It was time for me to board. Neil, Mike, and I lay side by side on 3 couches tightly strapped in. Beneath us, I heard a rumble, like a faraway train. But as we lifted off, the movement felt so gentle that if I had not been looking at the instruments, I would never have known we were on our way. Outside the window of the Apollo 11, the Earth grew smaller and smaller. At last, we were so far away that I could hold up my thumb and block the bright disk from my sight. After 5 hours, we could take off our spacesuits and helmets and move around the cabin. We ate chicken salad and applesauce for dinner with shrimp cocktail, my favorite of our freeze-dried choices. Then it was time to rest. Wrapped in sleeping bags, we floated above the couches, comfortably weightless. For this time, Apollo 11 was our home, a tiny bubble of air and warmth, speeding through the icy cold of space. 4 days after launch and after traveling 240,000 miles, we were in orbit around the moon. Apollo separated into 2 parts, Columbia, where Mike would wait in orbit, and the Eagle, the lander. The Eagle was powerful enough to take Neil and me down to the moon's surface and back up to Columbia. But its walls were so thin I could have pushed a pencil through them if I had tried. The computer had chosen a spot for the Eagle to land, but through the window we could see that it was too rocky. We couldn't rely on the computer to land the Eagle safely. We would have to do it ourselves. Neil took control. I called out to let him know how far we were from the ground. 200 feet? 100? 40? By the time the Eagle landed, we had used up almost all our fuel with only 20 seconds left to spare. But we had made it. We were safely on the surface of the moon. I grinned at Neil. There was no need to say anything. We had work to do. Flight and spaceflight had always meant motion to me, but now the Eagle stood perfectly still. Neil and I put on our spacesuits. Neil climbed out first and descended Eagle's ladder to the moon's surface. Everyone listening back on Earth heard Neil's first words. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I climbed down the ladder and joined Neil. There was no color on the moon. A flat landscape of rocks and craters stretched in all directions. Everything was gray or white. The shadows and the sky above were black as the blackest velvet I had ever seen. I exclaimed, "Magnificent desolation." I could see Earth, our home, and the sky overhead. Blue water, white clouds, and brown land. I could see the continents, and I knew that they were younger than the moon dust in which Neil and I were now leaving our footprints. I took out the American flag from the compartment where it was stored. Neil and I could force the pole only a few inches into the moon's soil. I knew that more than 500 million people back on Earth were watching on television, and I worried that the flag would sag or tip. But when we took our hands away, it stood straight. I snapped off a crisp salute just as I was taught at West Point. We moved quickly on to other tasks. I became a rock collector again, gathering samples for study back on Earth. Still, I remember that brief moment perfectly, so many years later. I remember the pride I felt and how I imagined the pride of every American on Earth. Neil and I set up a plaque that would remain on the surface of the moon with the simple words, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." In 1961, President John F. Kennedy made a speech challenging Americans to land a person on the moon by 1970. By 1969, we had achieved that goal. It took engineering, genius, and hard work. It took both teamwork and individual skill. It took courage and sacrifice. Apollo was a success. Humans walked on the surface of another world. Neil and I were only the first. In all, 12 astronauts have visited the moon. However, 22 men and women from around the world have died exploring space. One of them was my good friend Ed White, who first gave me the idea of becoming an astronaut. Since the moon landing, I have worked to promote our future in space. The early NASA programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, were just a beginning. Someday, humans will travel farther than the moon. I believe we will go to the other planets in our solar system, perhaps live permanently on the moon or on Mars. One day you may buy a ticket on a spaceship as easily as you may buy an airplane ticket today. Perhaps some of these ideas seem impossible, but many people thought the same about our mission to the moon. Having a goal, even one that seems beyond our reach, can inspire us to achieve something magnificent. Not everyone can explore space, but we all have our own moons to reach for. If you set your sights high, you may accomplish more than you ever dreamed was possible, just as I did. Buzz Aldrin. Thank you for listening to this story. If you are interested in the full story, just send me an email and I can send you the recording of the full story.